Everyone. This is Tonya Barango, the self-care maven at Freedom at the Crossroads, and welcome to my channel again. So it's been a couple of days since I went live, and I just want to thank you again for showing up. And I wanted to talk about something equally important in relation to self-care, and that is Black women. I need you to ask yourself this. Who benefits when you don't center your self-care? And I wanted to talk about that because there's a lot going on here. April 5th is coming up. There's talks of that. And if you know what that means, a call to pick up, and get out there and put yourself on the line. Well, yeah, we're not doing that today. And we're not doing that, hopefully, on the 5th of April. But let's bring it back to who benefits when you don't center your self-care as a Black woman. Now, historically, and the reality of our situation is of living as a Black woman, existing as a Black woman here in the US, we are still carrying the load of being seen as caregivers and workhorses, not just within our own communities and within our own families, but society at large. That strong Black woman myth, all of that discourages rest and self-care and ultimately self-preservation, because we know, we've seen it in the natural world enough. There is literally no organism in existence that lives on this planet that doesn't go into a rest mode, a self-recovery mode, a mode of nurturing and replenishment. And so the insanity of living here in being a Black woman, existing in Black bodies, is that for some reason, society just wants to skip over that. The dominant society just wants to skip over yeah, everything else and everyone else gets to rest except us. So that's where one of the areas where I'm always irked. And the more I see this happening, the more I watch it in real time. And maybe I'm triggered even more and enraged even more is because, one, I work in healthcare. I'm not a nurse or a doctor. I work on the laboratory end. And so, unfortunately, I see in real time, real data in terms of numbers from a numerical standpoint and what that means, how that manifests in the human body. So we get to see the numbers, the ultimate results of stress, burnout, and overwork. We get to see that on the back end. That shows up in your labs. And the research is out. The statistics are out. Living while Black can be extremely stressful. And anybody who's not living under a rock is aware of the research that was done around weathering, where that constant stress that we've internalized as Black people, and particularly as Black women, how that manifests in our health outcomes. And that's separate from the existing in the context of institutionalized racism. I know last year, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it was all over social media about the white nurse who was breaking bones of Black babies in the NICU. And I hate to say it, but it's scary that we as Black people were not surprised by that. We're not surprised by seeing that kind of thing manifest. So as a Black person, as a Black woman who is discouraged from actively participating in her own replenishment and nourishment and renewal, that even when you do get to the point where you're either pushed because of, something shows up physiologically where you're actively feeling or acutely feeling sick or drained or something that's driving you to go and seek medical care, right? Where you go and do that, but then you not only have the pressures that are around you from existing in, in Black bodies, but when you go to the healthcare facilities, when you go and access these resources that are supposed to help you, you have to navigate that space just as strategically as you do everything else. And that is exhausting. And so when it comes to the whole notion of, Black women not being encouraged to self-care and who benefits from that, you begin to, the more you open your eyes, the more you become self-aware, which is where the starting point of all of this anyway, when it comes to the notion of self-care, is ultimately breaking out of that pattern where you're so conditioned to being a cog in the wheel of this society, of putting, going on that, being on that hamster wheel, going nowhere. Once you become shocked out of that, and you take stock of not only your situation, whatever is going on in your world, and you're like, oh my God, is this what living is about? There's got to be something better, right? That is deliberate. These systems that we operate in as Black people, as Black women, this is deliberate. It is deliberate that healthcare is so problematic, not just for every other people, other segments of society here in America, but particularly problematic for Black people. When you look at such areas of healthcare professions like gynecology, and you do the hard and deep reading, and you find out how Black bodies, particularly Black women's bodies, were abused in the whole establishment of that area of healthcare, you begin to become cognizant and aware of that this self-care for us as Black people, self-care for Black women literally is revolutionary. And just, if this is making sense to you, hit that notification button, hit that follow button so that you can get more on self-care for Black women, self-care for us as a people, and how to access self-care strategically and get off the altar of other people's expectations, particularly society, and not to get political, but unfortunately, because of our history and context in this nation, our self-care, our existence is always going to be revolutionary, and it's always going to be political. Because when you have forces in action that are trying to extract labor resources from you as a commodity, that's literally commodifying you, trying to commodify your resistance, your existence, any pushback from you is going to be met with an equal and opposing force. And that manifests as, what do we have it? We see it play out on the streets here every day where correct me if I'm wrong, there's literally no day that some Black person or person of color is not wounded or unalived by the structures of institutionalized violence and racism, i.e., police, law enforcement. Law enforcement is just one, glaring example of something that wasn't built for us, for our good. And so when you talk about things of self-care, that's a reclamation process for us as Black people. Mainstream and what I like to call colonized version of self-care is not something that is accessible to us because what? It is something, that version of self-care is problematic even of it in its own right, because it's built on extractive ways and manners of accessing this thing we call self-care. It is based on exploiting indigenous practices from around the world, repackaging it, commercializing it, and then putting a price on it, on something that, as people of as people of the land, of the indigenous land, whether it's here, whether it's on the continent of Africa, self-care was never meant to be practiced or accessed in the way that you typically see in social media. And that's why there tends to be a huge disconnect for us as Black people, and particularly as Black women, because it has no cultural relevance or context. That's deliberate. Not to talk of, you have such things as pricing, as cost, that have, commodified these practices that also make it, for the most part, inaccessible. I spoke in another video of mine about how price points, when you look at things like, yoga or Pilates, all practices that are good for us, right? Not that there are something that is a practice that was, discovered or created by the powers that be in this society. Again, it's Pilates, yoga. These are all indigenous practices that have been disconnected from the ritual and cultural context in which they were supposed to be practiced. So why is anybody, surprised here? I've heard both from clients and colleagues, and even me, myself, when I began my own self-care journey, I had issues with accessing conventional self-care until I began to do the internal work and decolonize on my own and reclaim indigenous practices of my people, of how we care for one another, which is community based, but you also have the individual aspect in that encapsulates that as well. And so, again, like I said, there's a lot of historical context when it comes to, how, Black women are pushed out there to be the mule, basically, of everyone and everything. And so when it comes to trying to even get your mind around self-care, it's problematic. It becomes even more trying to figure out, when you first embark on this whole journey, this whole practice of, and even trying to think about self-care as a Black woman, it's so difficult to do that because society has so conditioned us to not care about ourselves, or rather, not that we don't care about ourselves, but to put so many barriers to do that, to care for yourself, to nourish yourself. So you have all these elements of frustration, you have resentment building up, you have burnout and overwhelm. All of that comes into play. You're incapable of focusing, you're incapable of seeing a path through, a clear path to what? Your overall health and well-being, and ultimately living your best life. In whatever form that that takes, whether it's, for some, it's actually, freedom to do whatever they want to do in life, whether it's move abroad, whether it's to stay in the US, whether it's any of those things. Those have been turned into literally luxuries for Black women, and for particularly Black women, and then on a larger context for Black people. We know that there are disparities in terms of, how people are paid. There's pay equity issues that have been ongoing. And so that also impacts and chops away at your ability to access these practices. And that's one of the major reasons why I'm so passionate about us reclaiming our indigenous ways of self-caring, of nurturing, of healing. Because when you go into spaces that are what I like to call predominantly white spaces, and thinking that, I'm going to get some self-care here, how is that possible? How is it possible to go into these spaces that you know historically are unsafe for you, whether it's mentally or physically? I just the other day I was on Threads where there's this whole, feed of women, talking, and not just women, but, black people in general talking about their experiences in some of these quote unquote studios and gyms where they're being mistreated or being subjected to microaggressions and all of that. Please tell me how you're going to heal in that environment. You're going to a gym to go and decompress. You're going to work out to improve your health. Meanwhile, the space is not safe to begin with. You have people, the same ratchet experiences you're having when you encounter the Karens and Kens of the world on the outside. You can't escape that. And so this is why it's so important. And I'm so happy and excited to see our spaces, our health and wellness people, fitness experts, and what have you, practitioners, creating safe spaces for our people to heal and up level our own health and well-being. Because it's when you're in these spaces, when you're in spaces that are germane and native to us, that's when you can be vulnerable and know that you can heal, you can talk, you can be ministered to by your own people, by your collective community and healing. And that's something that is absent in the conventional form of self-care, which tends to be very toxic. And it's toxic to us anyway, because we are in a vulnerable position trying to do healing, trying to self-care in a place that's already toxic. There's nothing more ironic than trying to heal in the same place that's poisoning you. And so that's a topic for another video. I've also done other videos on that where I speak to the whole notion of sometimes in order to heal, you're going to need to leave as part of your self-care strategy. You're going to need to actually physically in some way leave that environment. For some of our people, it is to, quit that toxic job. For some of us, it's move abroad. I've had stories, I've followed a lot of creators online who speak to these same issues. By and large, self-care, decolonized self-care, is contextual, it's meaningful, and yes, it is for our people, it's closed. And I need us to start normalizing the fact that traditionally, these practices, when it comes to self-care, self-nourishment, all of that, and ministering to each other in community and individually, because of the cultural context and rituals associated with these practices, with our indigenous practices, they necessarily have to be closed. They have to be closed because they have to be protected. Why? Because we are always walking around literally with targets on our backs as a people. And that's not just here in the diaspora. This is a anti-blackness and racism and colonialism in all its forms and in all of its repackagings. It's global. And so you find that a lot of there are indigenous groups now that are non-black indigenous groups that are beginning to start closing their practices. Again, you hear them talking about it on social media. I tend to be a part of a number of these different groups because I love to hear conversations about what we as indigenous, non colonizer people, our practices and how we used to do these practices. We lost a lot of that when we came here. Some of that we were able to retain. But now we're in an age now when we really have got to hone in and actively start reclaiming those practices. The other day on my live, I spoke about an indigenous practice from my family's, part of my family's practice of self-care for women in the context of going in, starting a life as a married woman on my father's side. It's a practice, an age-old practice where women are put in a special form of seclusion where they are encapsulated in a special and specific form of self-care as they step into the role of, being a wife, a different portion of their life, some other life stage that they're going through, whether it's you're going to be a new mom, or whether you're stepping into full adulthood, or whether you're stepping into marriage. There are certain practices, and I don't speak too much in detail on that because, again, that's a closed practice on my father's side, and I want to honor that. But these are things we're going to have to do and reclaim and then close off. I have a huge problem with non-black people trying to access practices like hoodoo. Hoodoo is an active healing modality for our people that is unique and specific to us. And that is a portion, that is a special category of self-care for us. But again, coming back to who actually benefits from you not self-caring. And you can see that in full operation in the workplace and capitalism at large, where human labor, and especially the labor of women, the labor of Black women, has become so rampantly commodified. And there's a historical context associated with that because what? This country and all of the colonial elements that established colonies globally, colonies, whether it colonies in Africa, whether colonies here in the diaspora, they all were built on the blood, sweat, and tears and labor of Black people. And the labor of Black women was a special kind of labor and continues to be one that is envied even in 2025. Case in point, the hashtag of, Black women, we're resting. Our people are resting. We've gone into rest mode because we've decided to pull our energy back and say, no more free labor from us. We're no longer going to put ourselves on the line for other people's comfort. I heard a TikToker, unfortunately, I can't remember her name, who coined the phrase, I am no longer setting myself on fire to keep other people warm. And that totally resonated with me, and it resonated with a lot of Black people, specifically Black women, because it speaks to the fact that labor is extracted from us, our ideas, our innovations, all of this. This is all a form of labor that other people, dominant culture, has commodified and has existed and built its institutions and its grandeur on us. So imagine when you start to reclaim that part, because literally you cannot escape the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of self-care in that context, because it's a kind of reclamation. It's a kind of autonomy, and it's a universal power that every human being has. Yet there is a certain segment of humans, of society, that wants to rob one group of that very autonomy that all of us have universally been given. So not to go too much out in the weeds, but know this: when we are overworked, when we are burned out, when we are setting ourselves on fire to keep other people warm, guess what? Those people get to build, they get to innovate, they get to have far better health outcomes. They get to do all of that to live their best lives while you are burned out and zombified. So all the advancements, all the progress that you would have made, that not just you as an individual, because remember, we are a communal people. All of those advances and progress that our community, not just from us as the individuals being healed and elevated, not just from that energy, but our community suffers all of that. None of our community has access to that when we don't have that. When we don't have focus, when we don't have energy, when we're experiencing burnout, all of that resentment, guilt, all of that coming and cooking up into a hot, toxic well, then it's nothing but destruction. Then it's nothing but poor health outcomes. And we're stymied in terms of progress. And so the truth of the matter is, and we have to own this as individuals, as people, understanding that women are the center. We are the life givers. And you cannot give life, you cannot give hope, you cannot give innovation, progress, any of that if you're giving from a place of emptiness. Nothing good comes from that. Nothing good comes from that for you, and nothing good comes from that as a community. And so understanding that, just as we as Black people understand the forces in operation around us that we have been interacting with, hence the way we voted last year, they also understand that when we reclaim, everything they've benefited from stops. That's why you have the outcry of, oh, where are the Black women at? Where's Mammy to come serve us? You know, where's Mammy to come burn herself out and put that cape on? Okay? So I'm going to leave it right there. But ultimately, you can see that at every level of society, when you don't self-care, when you don't center, because it's not a healthy thing. There is no living organism, for the most part, that will sacrifice itself without trying to heal. Even in the natural world, every living being, if you can look at the animals and in the wild, your pets, everything must heal, must reclaim, must center self. There is nothing healthy about centering other people. That's actually a flag to let you know that there's something you need to do, you need to work on internally, and you need to address, because you need to be asking yourself, why am I in that mode? Because unfortunately for us, that whole people pleasing was a way to justify our existence and survival to those who enslaved and stole our people. You had to literally prove your worth, that you were worth something, worth keeping alive. And so that survival strategy is maladaptive. In 2025, we should all be letting that go. And if you're having a hard time letting go, that's a reason, that's something to be aware of, and that's a key, that's a bell letting you know, an alarm that something is wrong. And something needs to be addressed, not fixed, because you're not broken. Human beings are not broken. We have healing that we have to do. Everybody gets traumatized at some point. It's just going through life. as a human being existing in this body and this plane of existence, you're going to experience some kind of trauma as you live life. The point of the matter is to heal, move through, progress, evolve, and move to the next level. And the problem comes when you're trapped in that cycle, i.e., you're conditioned and you're stuck in that cycle and you're unaware of the cycle one that you're in, and you're just like that hamster on that wheel. And so that's where the problem lies. But the moment people start waking up and reclaiming their autonomy and reclaiming their power, that's a problem from those who were exploiting it. There, I've said it. Exploitation. Capitalism is hyper exploitation. Argue with your mama. But yes, because as a people, for centuries, we were able to live, move, trade with various groups around the world without colonizing and destroying the planet. I've said it now. I've said it. It's Sunday and I'm saying it. So taking that back into the context of self-care, I don't want us to forget the fact that when we start really connecting with self and doing that internal healing that we need to do and working, because that self-care, that being able to even embrace that, it starts up here. And that's why historically our people were so traumatized and so brutalized as a mechanism to gain access to our mind so that they could condition it and bring it unto submission. So that what? You can access something that doesn't belong to you. You can take resources from somebody else that doesn't belong to you. I'll never forget, I'm going to, and I'll wrap up, in just a minute or two. Don't forget, hit the subscribe button and hit the notification button so the next time I go live or drop a video, you'll be aware of it. I do this every Sundays. I've committed to every Sunday at noon Central Standard Time to speak on self-care, women's issues, empowerment for Black women 40 and above. And I do talk about travel. I do talk about empowerment, and all of that. The overlying arch is self-care, because you can't do any of that if you don't take care of yourself and if you don't center yourself and decenter whiteness and patriarchy, if you don't decenter all of that, because those things are all related. They're all related. Because historically, generationally, patriarchy, white supremacy, that was not a thing. That is fairly recent. In spite of what other people would love you to believe, that wasn't a thing. We were trading, we were collaborating with other cultures around the world before colonization, before people decided that because they didn't have shit, pardon my French, they were going to take it from other people. Okay, I'll leave it right there. But having said that, there's always going to, when it comes to self-care, and that's why, I'm sure Audre Lorde said that, self-care is revolutionary and it is political, because our existence as a people in this part of the world in particular is political. And it's very inflammatory. Us having autonomy and reclaiming our power and reclaiming our energy, that's always been an issue for the powers that be that wanted to exploit that and wanted to exploit human beings and dehumanize them for their own needs so that they could elevate and grow themselves. That's a whole nother conversation where I talk about parasites, but I'm going to leave that right there. So again, self-care as a Black woman too, that brings up another issue. There's always going to be pushback. We see it in the workplace, and we see it societally, and you see that at pretty much every level of society. I you know COVID wasn't too long ago. Everybody, I'm sure, remembers the black man that was, bird watching, and he had a confrontation, and how that turned out. He was doing something that nourished his soul, that fed him, that was healing to him. And lo and behold, this is what he encounters. For anybody who's confused about that, you can Google is free. But the point I'm trying to make is this: whenever you begin to voice your needs and begin to center yourself, and this is in the workplace, this is amongst professionals, this is in the community, it happens even in families. And this is why boundaries are so important, and why boundaries are also scary when you first begin on this journey of self-care. Because one, you have to do the mental work that's needed to start generating those boundaries, but also you have to navigate and come to not just awareness, but you have to work through your own internal issues based on your own life experiences and individual trauma, or whatever, however that looks, in the process of creating those boundaries, with the understanding that for everything you do, there is going to be pushback. It happens in the natural world. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And that is true even when it comes to self-care. However, because we are so special and we have so many points of intersectionality in terms of existing as Black people, particularly as Black women, there are certain strategies that we have to, protective strategies that we have to put in place in order to navigate these spaces, so that you don't become even more vulnerable in your place of operation. So I spoke on another video, I spoke on what self-care would look like in a toxic work environment. How do you self-care? What strategies do you put in place as a Black woman and as a Black person? What strategies do you want to put in place? Do you need to put in place in order to self-care and be protective, preserve yourself, and not disappear in the mire of a toxic work environment? And then at a larger stage, we're talking about things at the community level and at the family level. How do you set boundaries? You must, in order to self-care, you cannot escape the fact that you must generate boundaries. And you're going to have to be okay with the consequences of that. Sometimes it's just a matter of people readjusting and renavigating and, coming to agreement and communicating about, the establishment of those boundaries and how they interact with those boundaries. But by and large, ideally speaking, the pushback you get in families from you setting boundaries can be entirely benign. Just maybe a little bit some people may be a little bit grumpy about you having certain boundaries around certain things, or like, okay, I have to adjust, fine, I have to adjust. But mostly the negative impacts you get the negative pushback you get practicing self-care as a Black person, as a Black woman, outside of that relatively safe space of family and community, it can get pretty dark. And that's, we've had headlines that attest to that throughout Google. I don't need to go there, and I don't need to make you hyper aware of that, because our collective experience speaks to that and gives credence to that. So having said that, at the end of the day, it's about, when it comes to self-care and you neglecting your self-care, as a Black woman, you need to be asking yourself, who benefits if I trash myself, if I'm unhealthy, if I'm unfocused? Nobody benefits but the people who are exploiting my people pleasing, who are exploiting my, strong Black woman, who are exploiting me, caping for and muling for everyone but myself. There's nothing healthy in that. And so that is the ultimate takeaway I want to have for Black women to really internalize in 2025. I don't think there's ever been a spotlight on the necessity for true decolonized self-care than this year of 2025. There's so much going on globally. There's a lot going on nationally and locally that speaks to and confirms the necessity of that. And as I'm sure that as we move further into 2025 with all the shenanigans that are going on, that's going to play an even more important role for us as a community of Black people. That notion of self-care and closing, decoupling from and decentering colonized self-care, because that was never for us. That's for a bunch of people who don't look like us with false positivity and trying to sell you something and extract your resources, the resources that you do have, separate you from that. That is what that is for. Same thing with this whole, what do you want to call it, missionary thing. That's a whole nother rant of mine I've spoken to, and a number of other Black people have spoken to, and non-Black people have spoken on it as well, regarding the purpose and the whole strategy behind proselytizing to Africans and non-Black and other POC, preaching this while taking that. So that's a whole nother story and a whole nother rant. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned something. And again, please subscribe, keep me going, keep me motivated to keep dropping these gems. I am a women's self-care and health coach, and I do help Black women over the age of 40 get off the altar of other people's expectations, reclaim their health, their well-being through self-care, liberation. That is liberation. And it is radical. And yes, it is revolutionary. So thank you again for tuning in. I will also drop some links, some resources. I do have some on some of my other videos where I know that, things are interesting right now, especially with the economy, and people have to really be strategic about spending their money. I'm just going to say it. And so I do have free resources. I have some links in my videos. And if you go to freedomatthecrossroads.com, go to the resource page. I do have links to free resources. I have a free self-care guide as well. This is just an introduction to self-care and what that looks like. If you need more, you can book a consultation with me. But by and large, I have free resources available. Also, Therapy for Black girls is a whole movement. There are resources there if you need a Black therapist, a mental health provider. They have resources there. Like I said, go to the blog, Freedom at the Crossroads, on the resource page. I do have links to at least the Midwest and some other free links that, our people can that can safely access to get the resources they need, either, free or within reason. So definitely check that out. And I'll see you next Sunday, Central Standard Time at 12 p.m. So thank you for joining me, and stay blessed, stay encouraged, and stay aware. And don't be afraid to use your voice. Be strategic. Seek community. And please, it's long overdue. Let's stop inviting people to the cookout. They don't need to come. Okay? Till next time. Bye.